Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I've been wanting to do a series of recordings on this Paul Was Not a Christian book, The Original Message of a Misunderstood Apostle by Pamela Eisenbaum for quite a while. This is its page on Amazon. You can go there and have a look at it if you want. I do recommend buying it, but I'm also going to read through it here for you and do a little bit of commentary as we're going along. So you can get my reactions, my criticisms too on it. At the same time, I'm not in any way going to try and undermine the academic prowess of Pamela Eisenbaum and her expertise in so many areas. I'm just going to give my reactions as an educated Orthodox Jew, educated on the matter of Christianity, and I suppose maybe augment some of the things that I think might be worthwhile augmenting, also criticizing if necessary as we go along. I suppose the essential basis of this is coming from the new perspective on Paul, where it's sort of regarding that we should probably regard Paul not as somebody who practiced Christianity, because Christianity didn't exist at the time that Paul was writing, but as somebody who practiced Judaism and was promoting an understanding of Judaism, which I think is a better way of doing it. The response is a sort of reaction against the past couple of hundred years or few hundred years of influence of Calvinism, where they've presented Paul very much as kind of an antinomian, somebody who opposed the law, laws of Moses and the Torah, and sort of also opposed Rome and Peter, because there was this attempt to sort of create a sort of a dichotomy between Paul versus Peter, Pauline Christianity versus the rest of Christianity, because the Calvinist Protestants were trying to sort of build a fortress and fortify themselves in their position of opposition to Rome, which they traditionally associated with Peter, and therefore didn't hesitate to sort of use Paul and this sort of conflict that was between Paul and Peter over the matters of circumcision or eating with Gentiles, and blew it up out of all proportion to sort of justify their position, almost creating a completely new religion in the process. But in order to do that, they had to divorce Paul from his Jewish background and his origins, and present him as somebody from a new religion, and that's also one of the reasons why Calvinism promoted, John Calvin himself promoted a lot of anti-Semitism. He had some horrendous things to say about the Jews, because they didn't want to look at Paul in the light of Judaism, but in their own light. They created a new context in the same way the Abbasids created a new context for Umayyad Islam. So too the Calvinists created a new context for Pauline Christianity, so that what they ended up with is actually nothing like Pauline Christianity, historical Pauline Christianity, but is actually a new invention, a new religion, which undermines the message of Paul. Okay, well, without further ado, I shall get into this and make some comments as we go along. So it's the introduction first. There's 14 chapters and an introduction, so 15 in all. And I'm just going to do the introduction for us today. It begins. Once, when visiting a large, wealthy metropolitan church on Easter Sunday, makes you wonder why she was visiting a large metropolitan church on Easter Sunday, but she could have been invited as a guest. It's not the sort of thing that usually happens. Maybe she's just visiting to see the spectacle of the whole thing, perhaps. I understand that there are schools of Orthodox Jews who would oppose to stepping inside of a church, so it's quite interesting to consider which school she might be in. Anyway, she continues. I listened to a man give a testimony about his conversion to Christianity. He spoke of how he yearned for spiritual meaning and sought eagerly for religious truth throughout his life. He seemed to me to be on the young side of middle age. But he was always disappointed with the answers given to him. That is, until recently, when he discovered Christ. Suddenly, he realized his former life was a life of sin. Before his conversion, he explained, he had been Jewish. But now he had accepted God's unconditional loving act of grace in Jesus Christ and had given up the sin of Judaism. Yep, we come across people like that a lot, I'm afraid. Admittedly, I can no longer remember the details of the man's speech, which was rather lengthy, but I'm certain he associated, if not equated, a life in Judaism with a life in sin. When he began to speak of his sordid past, I was expecting something more stereotypical, at least what I imagined to be stereotypical, of Christian testimonies in American Protestant evangelical context. I thought he would say that he had been an alcoholic or a drug addict, or had abused members of his family, or had been obsessed with money and prestige and lived in a vain, empty life. But he never mentioned any of these things. His description of his former so-called sinful life sounded perfectly respectable to me. The mention of the words Judaism and sin in the same sentence came as a painful shock, to say the least. And sadly, this is the anti-Judaism I talk about, which is so prevalent in so many sects of Christianity. Well, I would say in Christianity as a whole. As a Jew, the idea that Judaism is a flawed religion inherently linked to sin is deeply offensive. I agree with you. Unfortunately, this idea has been linked to the Apostle Paul, but it really comes from a long history of Christian interpreters of Paul. While Christians of virtually every stripe, Catholic and Protestant, mainline and evangelical, now willingly accept that Jesus was a Jew, Paul is typically viewed as the first true Christian. The image of Paul as the first true Christian also requires him to be the first true convert to Christianity. The traditional story of Paul looks something like this. Paul was originally a zealous Jew who was persecuting the church until something utterly miraculous happened. The resurrected Jesus appeared to him. This revelation led to Paul's conversion from Judaism to Christianity, from being a zealous Pharisee to being an unstoppable preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Once converted, he realized the futility of Judaism with its endless demands of the law and rejected it. That's the traditional presentation, yeah. At least that's the way Christians present it. Combining assumptions about Paul's biography with the theology of his letters as they understood them, Christian interpreters came to believe that Paul's conversion experience led him to articulate the doctrine of justification by faith, a doctrine that stands at the core of Christianity, and at the same time constructs Christianity as the antithesis of Judaism, typically considered a religion of works. Although, according to this view, Christianity correctly recognizes the inevitable failure of human beings to achieve righteousness and thus the necessity of accepting God's grace in the form of Jesus Christ, while Judaism mistakenly puts its faith in the ability of human beings to achieve salvation through their own efforts. Christian theologians throughout the ages have varied as to whether they see Jews as merely misguided or willfully defiant, but there's always been agreement that a theology that endorses salvation by works reflects a bad religion because it denies the grace of God. Thus, the man who described his conversion from Judaism to Christianity as a move from sin to grace had followed the traditional Pauline script to near perfection. Because the negative image of Judaism is so closely linked to the Apostle Paul, most Jewish interpreters of Paul have not had good things to say about him. I'll just put a caveat in here. Most, but not all. I would say that would be most who haven't studied deeply, because the ones who did study deeply, like Jacob Emden, for example, don't have bad things to say about Paul. It's only those who touch the surface have bad things to say about Paul. Likewise, if you read various views on the Toledoth Yeshu, you realize, which is actually a book against the son of Mary Magdalene, not against Jesus Christ. It presents, some of them present Paul's school as fighting against the heresy of Mary Magdalene's son, Yeshu HaNotzri. And so again, he's presented in a rather positive light, although other interpretations of that book or other versions say that it's Peter, not Paul, who was doing that. So, but fair enough. There are plenty of, shall we say, observant Orthodox Jewish people who haven't studied the matter deeply and are not very interested in studying the matter deeply, and that does present a negative image in what we call general Judaism. So most, in that case, general Jewish interpreters of Paul have not had good things to say about him. They're at the lower level of study. They haven't gone into deep studies of Judaism. However, my interest in writing a book on Paul began not out of spiteful resentment towards him, but because I passionately identified with his perspective on the world. Like Paul, I live as a Jew among Gentiles. Although I am Jewish, my scholarly expertise in the origins of Christianity landed me a teaching position in a Christian theological school. To be sure, not all of my students are Christian, and not all are studying for the Christian ministry, but many of them are. Although I never envisioned teaching in such an institution when I began my scholarly career, I now consider it a privilege. Being in a Christian institution has made me more self-consciously Jewish. Remarkably enough, it has also contributed to my ability to see Paul as a Jew. Moreover, I have come to regard Paul as a Jew who wrestled with an issue with which many modern American Jews wrestle: how to reconcile living as a Jew with living in and among the rest of the non-Jewish world. I think it is safe to assert that this issue transcends the peculiar situation of modern American Jews. Stated generically, the problem to which I refer concerns the relation of a peculiarity to universality. Anyone who wishes to maintain the peculiarity of his or her ethnic or religious identity without denying the validity of another's peculiar identity faces the same problem. I think Paul reflected on this problem and ultimately developed some powerful insights on the subject, insights that have largely been overlooked because of the traditional image of Paul as a Christian. I'll just put in another sort of point here in reflection to this. I think if you studied Judaism and believed the Mishnah properly, you wouldn't find that Paul was doing anything other than bringing out the Mishnaic interpretation of the message to the children of Noah. And I'm surprised that she didn't make that comment now, but maybe she'll make that comment later. She says, unless one first recognizes that Paul was a Jew, both before and after his experience of Christ, and that he struggled with the cognitive and physical dissonance of being a Jew in a world with non-Jews, one cannot see how Paul confronted the problem of human difference. Thus, this book is an attempt to resurrect, if you will, Paul as a Jew, in order to offer a constructive alternative reading of Paul's letters that Christians, Jews, and perhaps others will find compelling. I also write this book as a challenge to the portrait of Paul that has reigned for nearly 2 millennia. I intend to expose the bias embedded in the traditional portrait of Paul and the ways in which it has contributed to gross misrepresentations of Judaism and played no small role in the history of anti-Semitism. At the same time, and just as important, I intend to demonstrate that I can explain Paul's letters compellingly and thereby construct a more credible and more persuasive portrait of Paul for readers interested in having a better grasp of Paul's life and work. The image of Paul in this book portrays a man who, to paraphrase Kirster Steindal, was called rather than converted. In other words, Paul was called by God to fulfill a particular mission, one that was foretold in the Hebrew prophets, to bring knowledge of the one God, the God of Israel, to all the nations of the world. I'll just mention there's a footnote number 1 there about Kirster Steindal. I'll read it at the end of the passage, at the end of the introduction. Paul believed that the recognition of the one God by the Gentiles was necessary so that they might have a share in the world to come. This is a standard Jewish belief that in order to be guaranteed a place in the world to come, you must believe in the God of Israel and the revelation at Mount Sinai. Thus, Paul was not a Christian, a word that was in any case completely unknown to him, she says, because it had not yet been invented. But I'm wondering if that's really her words, since she is such a renowned academic, esteemed academic. And it's clear that Paul's scribe, Luke, knew this word, as he put this word into the book of Acts, and everything Luke learnt was from Paul. Well, not everything, but most of it was from Paul. So he certainly would have known the word Christian, although perhaps what she's saying is the word Christian at that time was being used as an insult, which it is in the book of Acts. Or perhaps she's rather referring to Christianity as a religion that didn't exist and wasn't named in the Bible, which is true. It didn't exist and wasn't named. And perhaps the publisher has just edited it to make it flow the way they want it to, thereby sort of not realizing that they actually sort of undermine the knowledge of their author in the way they edit it, making it look like she didn't know such a basic thing. But I'm certain that she did. Anyway, she continues, he was a Jew who understood himself to be on a divine mission. As a Jew, Paul believed himself to be entrusted with the special knowledge God had given only to Jews. However, Paul also believed the resurrection of Jesus signaled that the world to come was already in the process of arriving, and that it was time to reconcile non-Jews to God. Reconciling non-Jews to God also meant reconciling non-Jews to Jews, not because they were necessarily hostile to each other, but because if all people were potentially children of God, Jews and Gentiles must now be considered part of the same family. This entailed a new level of interaction and intimacy. Well, again, she hasn't mentioned the Mishnaic view that Gentiles who observe the 7 laws of Noah are considered part of the same family. So it's making me wonder, hopefully there will be reference to that later. It's making me wonder how deeply she has studied Judaism in comparison to her study of Christianity and Paul in particular. Of course, she will be observing Judaism as any Orthodox Jew should, no doubt. But the matter is, has she actually studied Judaism to the level that she might have found helpful in her work? Probably not, judging by this introduction, but let's see what happens in the rest of the book. She continues, contrary to prevailing opinion, I think Paul's theological orientation to the world can be used productively for thinking about religious pluralism. I hope to demonstrate this claim successfully in the pages that follow. Furthermore, I hope this book will enable Jewish as well as Christian readers to develop an appreciation for Paul's theological pluralism. So the pluralism, I guess, that she's referring to, I would have mentioned the laws of Noah, which are there in the book of Acts, and so is a proof that, I mean, where do you think Luke learnt about that from? You know, he had to learn that from his teacher, right? Which would be Paul. And that's a Mishnaic issue, which was being discussed in chapter 15 of the book of Acts. So there's your religious pluralism. But let's see. She continues, Jews have typically portrayed Paul as the great betrayer of Judaism. Again, she didn't mention Jacob Emden there, or any of those who have put comments about him in the Toledoth Yeshu as basically on the side of Jews. There's more than one version of the Toledoth Yeshu, but there are versions of it which present him on the Jewish side, and that's certainly the side that Jacob Emden viewed. So this is again showing her lack of deep knowledge of Judaism, but rather a sort of surface general knowledge of general Judaism as practiced generally by the general Orthodox Jewish population. As I said myself many times, I was also unaware of the difference between Yeshua HaNatzi and Jesus Christ. I thought that it was the same until several years ago, and I didn't realize that they were different people. But the more deeply you study in Judaism, the more you realize, and the more respect you have for Judaism, the more you realize that that's impossible, that the son of Mary Magdalene couldn't possibly have been the person that they are referring to as Jesus Christ, especially since it was Jesus Christ's disciples and apostles who were fighting against the son of Mary Magdalene, in the Toledoth Yeshu in Jewish tradition. So surprised that she hasn't. Well, she is. I mean, she is. Her speciality is this subject, but I'm surprised that since that's the case, that she hadn't delved deeply into the matter, or that she doesn't have so much respect for Judaism to view the general traditional interpretation of the stories as rather insulting to Jews and Judaism, which it is. When you get deeper into it, you realize how insulting it is to view the traditional understanding of those books, to view that as the correct understanding. It's rather insulting, and it's not the view that Jacob Enden had anyway. And I'm a Sabbatean. I shouldn't like Jacob Enden, but you know, you have to give credit when credit is due. He wasn't a friend to the Sabbateans. He was an enemy to the Sabbateans, but he knew his stuff. Anyway, so she says that they portrayed him as a betrayer of Judaism. I think that's just a general uneducated Jewish view. I think this image, she says, is as much mistaken as the traditional Christian image. She's correct. It is mistaken, and if she hopefully will make reference to Jacob Enden, she'll be showing us exactly why it's mistaken. Viewing Paul as a Jewish heretic, she says, has resulted in nothing more than Jewish ignorance of an important theological resource. I like that. I like the idea of presenting Paul as an important theological resource. Hope that will be developed more. Given the history of Jewish-Christian relations, Jewish antipathy to Paul is no surprise. At the same time, the history of Jewish-Christian relations seems to me, she says, to warrant crossing the traditional boundary between the two faiths, along with a refashioning of what constitutes Jewish and Christian identity in particular, and interfaith relations in general. Just as the God of biblical history is a dynamic and not a static force, so too are our religious traditions. So that's the end of the introduction. I'll be back with chapter 1 at a later date. I hope you enjoyed that.